I'm just kind of the warm-up band for Richard, who's the expert on this stuff. But I just wanted to provide, I guess, a bit of a background. Can we go to the next one, please? And explain why this transparency. Oh, okay. Whoops, okay. Why transparency and beneficial ownership has taken on such a life of its own at the OECD these days. So let's just briefly look at what happened that got us into this position. The first point, I think, is that the income tax systems in the world are grossly outdated. They don't work. They're arbitrary. They're based on, kind of 20th century concepts. And part of the problem with that is you can't decide what's an abuse anymore, because there's so much political interference in the income tax systems that you can't tell whether you're just taking an advantage of an incentive or whether you're abusing it. And that leads to the second point, that then there's a proliferation of off-the-peg schemes. And again, no one can tell whether they're abusive or not. They erode the tax base, and they enable companies to carry on business in jurisdictions without having a tax nexus there. Then what happens is the 2008 financial crisis. A couple of consequences of that. One is people around the world get very upset that they're not as well off as they used to be. And secondly, governments start cutting their budgets. And one of the budgets they cut is the tax revenue collection budgets, or the revenue officials. And we'll get back to why that's significant in a second. In addition to this, we have the growth of civil society, Action Aid, a tax justice network. These very well-meaning, well-intentioned people who are feverish about corporations and how they're raping and pillaging and how the poor people in the world are suffering as a consequence. Then we have the new awareness with Google, Apple, Starbucks, and what's going on there. These people aren't paying taxes, but you are. And you're very upset about that because it's not fair. So what do the politicians do? BVI politicians, of course, accepted. What do? They do what's crowd-pleasing. What's crowd-pleasing is you attack the large multinationals. So then what happens is the governments all say to their citizens, okay, we're going to attack this. We're going to go after base erosion and profit shifting. The G20 gets involved, the OECD's involved, they come up with 15 action points, and they're going to go after treaty shopping and all of these other problems that are causing all the misery in the world. What's wrong with that? Well, let's just take Canada for an example. I could probably use any other country in the world, but it's the one I'm closest to in terms of the example. In the Canadian system, if you have you have a subsidiary that's outside of Canada, and it earns passive income, interest income, royalty income, it pays tax in Canada on that money immediately. If it earns active business income, which of course is subject to about a 15-page definition, but if it earns active business income, it doesn't pay tax. So what do? You set up a Barbadian subsidiary that lends money into the US. Active business in the US. That income is deducted in the US from active business income, goes to Barbados. Without a special rule, that Barbados income would be immediately taxed in Canada because it's passive. But the Canadian Tax Act has a special rule in it that says if you're earning active business income in particular countries, such as the US, and you pay an amount to an affiliate, it retains its character as active business income. Why? Because then it's not immediately taxed in Canada when it's received in Barbados. And in fact, it creates a surplus pool in the Barbados company, and that money can then come back to Canada free of any Canadian tax. What did I just describe? I just described the basic classical definition of base erosion and profit shifting. We have a specific rule in the Income Tax Act that is there for no reason other than to promote that. The US has exactly the same thing with their check-the-box rules. Now let's look at the other side, investment into Canada. What does Canada want? It wants investment. Does it care whether the investor is paying tax in its home jurisdiction? No. So what do? We enter into treaties with Luxembourg and Barbados. Do we do that because we really think there's a lot of residents in Luxembourg that are desperate to invest in Canada? Of course not. The only reason we do that is so that anybody in the world that wants to can pick the most favorable treaty that Canada has and invest into Canada. Why? Because we want to promote investment in Canada, and we don't care what's happening in the ultimate home jurisdiction. Does the US do the same thing? Of course they do. How do they do it? Because in all their treaties, they enter into these limitation on benefit provisions, which are supposed to prevent people from so-called treaty shopping, choosing a jurisdiction of convenience to come into the US. But what do they put in their limitation on benefits provision? They put what's called a derivative benefits provision. What does that mean? It means that if I'm coming in from the Netherlands into the US, but I really started off in UK, for example, if under the UK treaty, the ultimate owner could have gotten the same benefits that they can get under the Dutch treaty, then the limitation on benefits provision doesn't matter. What that means is you don't really need any substance in the Netherlands. You can just come in, UK, Netherlands holding company into the US. Again, without going into any more detail on it, it's the same as the Canadians just saying we're going to have a treaty with Luxembourg. It's a specific provision in the US treaties that has no purpose, really, other than to promote treaty shopping. And yet, these are the countries, and I'm just using these two as an example, that are out there making it very loud and clear to their population that they're attacking these great abuses. But of course, when it comes right down to it, they don't want to, because it's against their underlying economic policy of what they're trying to achieve. And the patent box comment is just the UK's been talking about it as of last week. Italy's talking about it. This is kind of a ring fence system where you say, okay, if you got a new patent or a patent, we're going to tax it at a low rate for a period of time because we want the intellectual property in our jurisdiction. Now, in 1998, the OECD launched on this great project on harmful tax competition, harmful tax practices. What happened? The same thing that's happening now because of the Canada and US's position with base erosion and profit shifting. Well, first of all, they were going to go after places that didn't charge much tax, but that didn't work well because Switzerland and Ireland didn't charge a whole lot of tax, and they didn't really, so kind of 10% became some kind of a reasonable number. And then they tried to ring fence things and said, well, if it's a ring fence system, that is a special system, a special regime within a jurisdiction that allows people to pay lower tax than they otherwise would, we'll go after that. But it started to unravel a little bit, and at the end, harmful tax competition just came down to exchange of information. I don't say just. Exchange of information is a huge thing, but it came down to exchange of information, not a more fundamental attack against so-called perceived tax havens. The same thing is going to happen with BEPS, base erosion and profit shifting. There's going to be some tinkering around the edges, but where the cannons are really pointed is towards transparency, cooperative compliance, mutual assistance. In Berlin in October, there was a meeting. They got 123 countries now that at one stage or another have signed on to instantaneous exchange of information with respect to certain situations. And this cooperative compliance and all this transparency, again, part of this goes back to the reduction in revenue budgets. They don't have as many people now, and they're trying to collect and do much more than they could ever do before, particularly in the international arena. The only way they can do that is to get somebody else to do the work for them. And whether it's the tax return repairers in terms of forcing them to collect much more information than they provide the tax authorities with, or whether it's the governments or BVI, for example, enforcing them to collect more information and send it to them and exchange it with them because they have fewer people to do it, and more of a focus on substance than there was before in terms of holding companies. Okay, so Richard is going to talk about information exchange transparency a little bit, just in terms of really busting through the bubble here. I mean, what kind of opportunities might this create for the BVI? Well, I don't know, but if you want to move a little bit away from financial services to more of a holding company supporting jurisdiction, and you do have a tax information exchange agreement with Canada now, which to some extent is going to provide some benefits for Canadian companies coming into the BVI. Maybe there's an opportunity to provide a little bit more substance down here. Whether it's in specific areas or developing an expertise in particular areas, or whether it's just more head office type of personnel, more people who are trained as directors who can go on boards and the like. I mean, for example, in Ireland and Switzerland, to some extent, they're regarding BEPS as a great saving thing. Why? Because there's focus on more substance. So it's great. They're going to appoint more Irish people and more Swiss people in these companies and get more substance in the jurisdiction. And part of where this is going is maybe there's an opportunity for the BVI here, again, in terms of directors, in terms of having more substance, maybe in terms of just giving some of the younger people here, jobs in this kind of industry in terms of what can happen. The other thing is that Ireland and Switzerland are winning because they have a 10% tax rate. And if you go to zero, that's tax haven stuff. That's no good. You can't get away with zero. But if you had a 10% rate, that'd be fine. You'd be the same as Ireland and Switzerland. So what's wrong with that? Why wouldn't you consider other areas in the world have special regimes where you pay 25 or 30% normally, but if you have a patent or if you're an international business corporation in Barbados, you can get down to 1%, but then of course you put most of it in a branch in Singapore, so you actually get down to 0.1%. But special regimes where you pay less tax. Why don't you guys think about having a special regime where you can elect to pay 10% tax? Why would that make any sense? Because a holding company in that situation that would otherwise be in Switzerland or Ireland would presumably have pretty much the same kind of benefits here, and maybe it's something to think about. Anyway, that's my introduction to what Mr. Hay is going to say.